It's time now for perspective. This week we're heading to Sri Lanka, currently in the grips of its worst economic crisis in decades. More than a month of predominantly peaceful protests against the government's handling of the economy turned deadly last week when supporters of the former Prime Minister stormed an anti-government protest site in the commercial capital, Colombo. Days of subsequent clashes between protesters, government supporters and police left 9 dead and more than 300 injured. My guest today is Bhavani Fonseka, a Sri Lankan human rights lawyer and activist. Thank you so much for speaking to us on France 24 today. I'd like to start by asking you what the atmosphere is like in Colombo right now.
Thank you for having me. So in Sri Lanka, we are in a state of emergency, and the protests, though, continue. As you reported, there was violence at the protest sites last week, but regardless, the protesters have come out, and now it's been going on for over 35 days now in terms of calling for the resignation of the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So the protests continue, but the president remains in office. So there is really no result in terms of that demand. But the last few weeks also called for the resignation of the then Prime Minister and the government, and that happened last Monday on the 9th. So there's been some demands that have been met, but the main demand is for the president to leave office, and that is yet to happen.
And basic food supplies, medical supplies, also most recently petrol, fuel, are in extremely short supply in the country. Just how worried are people about those material lacks that you're facing right now in Sri Lanka?
Extremely worried, and it's extremely dire on the ground in terms of trying to find essential items. But that has been the case for several weeks now. So for several weeks, we've had difficulty finding food and medicine, fuel, gas. That has led to long queues to get these items, long queues to get petrol and diesel. And the protests really stemmed from that, the economic hardships people were facing, and long power cuts. I mean, we've been having long power cuts for several months now. So it is very, very dire. And on Monday, the new Prime Minister came out and publicly commented saying that the petrol supply is very limited. It's only for a day that we have petrol, and that things are going to get worse before it gets better. So that's indicative of some of the difficulties. But on a practical level, many are finding it extremely challenging to survive at the moment.
And with the Prime Minister himself saying that things are expected to get worse before they get better, are you expecting to see that reflected in the street protest movement we were seeing last week and into this week?
So the street protests have been there for several months now. These have been very much citizen-led, peaceful protests till violence erupted last Monday. And that violence came, I want to be very clear, from the government side, so that it was state-sponsored violence targeting the protesters. Regardless, it's not just the violence, but there's been threats of arrest, intimidation, court orders trying to prevent the protesters from protesting. Regardless of all these measures, the protesters have been persistent in the protests. They've been demanding for a system change, for the president to resign, and they're continuing. If anything, the violence of last week has really strengthened their call, and there's more and more people coming out and peacefully protesting. And this is not just in Colombo, this is across Sri Lanka, where citizens are on the streets peacefully asking for a system change in Sri Lanka.
And that leads me on to my next question, actually, which is, to what extent, in your opinion, does the anger on the streets stem from a more historic sense of injustice in the country? Because it is, of course, important to remember that just one family, the Rajapaska family, has essentially been in power in the country for decades.
So that's a good question. And today we mark 13 years since the end of the war. And 2009 was the end of the very, very bloody end to the war. And that war, the last stage, the way it was conducted during the last stage of the war is also attributed to the present president, who was the then Secretary for Defense. The president of that time, Mahinda Rajapaksa, is the prime minister who just resigned last week. So very much there's been violence linked to the Rajapaksa family, and not just violence, allegations of serious violations linked to them. So the family has been in politics for several decades, but they're also very much seen as divisive individuals, a family, and they're facing very, very serious allegations at the moment. And there's a school of thought saying that they're holding on to, at least the president is holding on to office, because with the office comes particular immunities of prosecution. So very much the family is facing allegations of violations and linked to violence in the past, but also more recent violence that was seen last week.
And do you think the Rajapaska dynasty, the president, do you think they're going to ultimately survive this crisis?
So the Rajapaksas, as I mentioned, has been in active politics for decades, and they've seen different setbacks. I mean, they were voted out of office in 2015, but they had a comeback in 2019. Now, this present moment, the economic crisis and the political crisis, I would say an unprecedented crisis in Sri Lanka, and their popularity has diminished considerably. Their base has diminished, but they still continue to have support among some sections. And I wouldn't put it past some Rajapaksas, especially the younger generation, to make a comeback. But at the present moment, they are possibly the most unpopular political family in Sri Lanka, and it's not looking good for them at the present moment.
Bhavani Fonseka, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Bhavani Fonseka, Sri Lankan human rights lawyer and activist, thank you so much for speaking to us on France 24 today.